Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naimon, your host. Today's guest is writer NoViolet Bulawayo. Born and raised in Zimbabwe, Bulawayo earned her MFA at Cornell University, where she was the recipient of the Truman Capote Fellowship. In 2011, she won the biggest literary prize in Africa, the Caine Prize for African Writing, and she is currently a Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. She's here today on Between the Covers to talk about her debut novel, We Need New Names, a book People magazine calls original, witty, and devastating. Welcome to Between the Covers, NoViolet Bulawayo.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
Your novel takes place in Zimbabwe during the Lost Decade. Could you orient our listeners to some of the things that were going on during the Lost Decade that inform We Need New Names?
We look at the Lost Decade as a time when things sort of fell apart in Zimbabwe due to failure of leadership. That translated in, for me, as somebody who was born right at the beginning of Zimbabwean independence, somebody who had a golden childhood, it just changed the country I knew. We are talking of things like the highest inflation in the world, to people dealing with power cuts every day, to election violence, to thousands and thousands of people leaving the country in droves, understandably looking for greener pastures. So that is the time, and I'd say the worst of it was around the 2008 elections, where violence kind of intensified as the government tried to cling to power. So that's where I wrote. That's the space that informed We Need New Names.
What really makes the novel unique in my mind, and also makes it congeal, is the choice that you made to tell it from the perspective of children. Mm-hmm. And even though you've described these really grim political situation, the feeling of reading the book is very buoyant, and the kids feel very full of hope and have big dreams, even though the reader knows that the background scenario isn't necessarily going to provide them. Can you talk a little bit about that choice to juxtapose the viewpoint of the children with this political situation?
I'm always interested in children, firstly because they are any society's most vulnerable victims. They are also voiceless. They never get to have a say where the big issues of the day are concerned. So I just wanted to write a book that gave the children the spotlight. But beyond that, I think children are amazing survivors. I think they are more equipped than adults to cope with any situation. Something happens, in 10 minutes the child is forgotten and is laughing. I wanted to capture that spirit of strength and resilience. And of course, I was working from a politically charged space, and I thought having children, a child protagonist and child characters gave me the distance, not to impose too much of my politics on the project, and I hope it did work.
I think it did, and it also allowed an opportunity to put some humor into the book.
Oh yes, humor is always important. I was just telling a friend how, it's just part of where I come from. No matter what the people are going through, somehow they remember to laugh, and I wanted that to carry in the book.
Well, let's talk about the protagonist, Darling. She has such a unique voice. Can you tell us a little bit about who Darling is and what her family situation is?
Darling is a 10-year-old girl, and when we first meet her, she and her family and friends have just moved to this shanty town called Paradise after they lose their homes to a government operation, after the government bulldozes their homes. And really this was inspired by what happened around 2005 in Zim. I remember, it was, I've been living here for like 13 years, and social media and the internet is part of my everyday life. So I woke up one day and there was this heartbreaking image of this kid who was sitting on his bulldozed home, and images started pouring in, and thankfully on the ground the camera was taking, the digital cameras, and people were posting. So I got interested in the story of these children, and of course I chose to develop Darling, or rather she imposed herself on the project that I was working on. And interestingly, I mean, I was writing this when I was in my late 20s, trying to find a connection to a 10-year-old kid in Zim while I'm outside presented an interesting challenge. So I found myself going back to my own childhood, even though myself and Darling had two very different childhoods. I grew up in a golden Zimbabwe, but I still went back to my childhood friends for the voice, for that, for what it felt like to be 10 years old.
It was really interesting how Darlene's voice feels so self-possessed. She feels like she has a lot of strength and that she doesn't rely on anything external. She's skeptical of prayer. She's skeptical of religion, and also at the NGOs that are coming with their aid. It's interesting as a non-African to read the book and have you flip the scenario, where somebody might assume from a distance that these are victims. Here they're very much portrayed as people who are empowered in a strange way in a circumstance that is difficult.
Oh yeah, empowered and very much trying to deal with their circumstances as best as they can, which I think also speaks to the resilience on the ground. I just went back home for the first time in 13 years, and of course it was not the Zimbabwe I knew, but what struck me is how people just adapted and went on with the everyday, coming from outside and having, assessed the country through the media, through stories. I mean, I speak to my family on it, quite often, and with Skype and email and internet, communication is easier. But just being there and seeing the strength and courage, it was quite amazing. And I wanted to celebrate that, because it's often easy to dismiss people in a space like this. But the reality is that people do not quit living. Somehow they keep going.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today with debut novelist NoViolet Bulawayo about her book, We Need New Names. NoViolet, do you have a section that maybe you could expose our listeners to Darling's voice?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So half of the novel is set in Zimbabwe, and then half is set in the US after Darling is able to move there to live with her aunt Fostalina. This section I'm going to read, she's just hanging out with her aunt one afternoon. I'm on my third Capri Sun now, and my stomach is so full of guava and liquid it could burst. I just ate the last of the guavas, and already I have this sadness thinking about the length of time, maybe years, before I will taste guava again. Aunt Fostalina is busy trying to order her push-up bra on the phone, and you can hear that she and whoever she is speaking to are having issues. The problem with English is this: you usually can't open your mouth and it comes out just like that. First, you have to think what you want to say. Then you have to find the words. Then you have to carefully arrange those words in your head. Then you have to say the words quietly to yourself to make sure you got them okay. And finally, the last step, which is to say the words out loud and have them sound just right. But then, because you have to do all this, when you get to the final step, something strange has happened to you, and you speak the way a drunk walks. And because you are speaking like falling, it's as if you are an idiot, when the truth is that it's the language and the whole process that's messed up. And then the problem with those who speak only English is this: they don't know how to listen. They are busy looking at your falling instead of paying attention to what you are saying. I have decided the best way to deal with it all is to sound American, and the TV has told me just how to do it. It's pretty easy. All you have to do is watch Dora the Explorer, The Simpsons, SpongeBob, Scooby-Doo, and then you move on to That's So Raven, Glee, Friends, Golden Girls, and so on, just listening and imitating the accents. If you do it well, then before you know it, nobody will ask you to repeat what you said. I also have my list of American words that I keep under the tongue like talismans, ready to use. Pretty good, for real, awesome, totally, skinny, dude, freaking, bizarre, messed up, tripping, allowance, clearance, douchebag, you're welcome, acting up, yikes. The TV has also told me that if I'm talking to someone, I have to look him in the eye, even if it is an adult, even if it's rude.
It makes sense to me that Junot Diaz, as editor of the Boston Review, would have recognized your work when he published your first short story, I believe. Yeah. I see a real resonance between the enterprise of what you both do, and I'm curious if you do as well. Exploring this idea of living in two places at once, essentially being haunted by the place they're not in, and also just a reinvention of the syntax of English to make it really reflect a different reality. Can you talk about any connection you might feel with him?
Absolutely. I mean, especially his Facebook drown, you are dealing with somebody who has left their homeland and is trying to negotiate an existence in the U.S. This idea of living or negotiating two different selves. And I remember reading the book. I mean, I grew up in Zimbabwe, and what was mostly available was, African literature and British literature. So we never really encountered writers on the margin. And I remember moving to the U.S. and being exposed to the many amazing, diverse writers. Junot Diaz, Sandra Cisneros really taught me a lot in terms of, what it meant to be an immigrant writer, and embracing it. It sort of gave me courage as a young writer. And there are numerous connections, and as you read more and wider, you see those things kind of resonate in immigrant literature.
Well, you mentioned that We Need New Names is split into two parts, essentially, the first being in Zimbabwe and the second when Darling goes to America. Was one part easier for you to write and find the voice in than the other? I would imagine that it would really draw on a very different part of yourself, each one.
Oh, yes. I mean, yeah, each really demanded a different part. But in terms of being easy, I'd say I had more fun writing the Zimbabwean section because I am Zimbabwean. I grew up there. I know it quite intimately. And my memories of the space, despite the hard background that I was writing against, were really beautiful. And I was able to kind of celebrate things, even as I was dealing with tough material. And then the voice, I'm intimately tied to the voice in that first section. And then the American section, Darling's voice shifts. Interestingly, I've heard readers talking about the writing kind of, becoming trite, weakening in the second section. But the thing is that they expect Darling to still sound very vibrant and fierce, and as she does in the first section. But what I was trying to go there that I think people sometimes miss is that something happens to yourself when you leave your homeland behind. It's like, and that's something that I identify with personally. I spent my first year in college in silence, for example. I couldn't speak in class. I only spoke at home because I had people speaking my language, my sister, my aunt. That shift of identity, trying to deal with this new space when identity is something that's very much tied to geographic space, trying to negotiate that. So there's a shift. Darling undergoes a shift. Was it hard to write? It wasn't necessarily hard to write, but the experience of it, I think, both on a personal level, was kind of challenging, and I was trying to capture that struggle. At home, she's always, at the center of things. She's always being part of the action. In America, we mostly see her looking at things and observing and commenting, which I think is what people can identify with, because you can't really own this land and it doesn't own you, and it sort of pushes you away because you don't always have the cultural currency to exist and be an intimate part of it.
Well, in the section you just read about Darling, she received some guavas from home in the mail, and and guavas are very central to her existence when she's living in Zimbabwe. And I feel like that was a really great section to choose to read because what's interesting about this dual reality between America and Zimbabwe in the book is in Zimbabwe, she's really focused on eating guavas. She's also going hungry, but we have this experience of her life being very full. And it's strange how we get to America and she doesn't get the guavas. She doesn't get the flavor of her homeland. And we really, even though she's surrounded by an enormous amount of material wealth, the cultural poverty seems to really be, when you're reading the America section, it feels like we really experience cultural poverty. And I thought you did that really well. The language does change. It becomes less vibrant. But I also felt like it reflected a poorer spiritual, cultural experience for the character.
Oh, yes. It definitely does, I think, because I think language that's something that arises from where you are, from what you are doing, and from the self that you are. And, in this section I just read, for example, she's just on the couch looking at Anne Foster-Lina. And I don't think we ever encounter her in such a situation back home. And guavas, yes. I mean, I remember coming here and noticing that in as much as there were so many trees around the neighborhoods, they were not fruit trees, and as an 18-year-old, I found that quite weird.
Yeah, I could imagine.
Yeah.
So in Zimbabwe, there's a neighborhood called Budapest in this book that is a wealthier neighborhood, and it's inhabited also by some wealthier white colonist families, and they go there to steal the guavas. It also feels like a precursor to her experience in America in a sense too, because when they go there, everything feels gated and there's less sounds and people seem to be less interactive and friendly. Did you see a resonance between Budapest and the foreshadowing of her going to the United States?
I always feel like Budapest can happen anywhere. That idea of spaces being together but kind of separate. In the same way, in America, I think the most intimate example is Elliot's house, this other fancy neighborhood where she goes not to steal but to kind of clean. So the dynamics of why she goes there have changed a little bit, but it's also there are similarities in the sense that she kind of still wants something there. She can't steal, but she has to pay for it. In other words, she has to provide labor. So the thing is, of course, she leaves Zimbabwe. She escapes Zimbabwe, escaping courts to a space where some of the dynamics still happen. And there, I guess, I was trying to look at what America means and the American dream, and really how real, how tangible it is.
Mm-hmm. In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to NoViolet Bulawayo about her debut novel, We Need New Names. NoViolet, tell us what the title means to you.
We Need New Names just speaks to how, as a people, it came from a very specific period in my country's history, how we need new ways of imagining things, of seeing ourselves, of doing things, from government to leadership to thinking about the world around us. And I see it as a title that transcends borders, because you have themes like, immigration, you have the NGOs. So it's a title that hopefully will inspire people to think about our identities, where we're going, and what we can do moving forward.
And there's also this really interesting use of names, like the name Paradise for a shanty town, and then her hearing Detroit, Michigan is Destroyed, Michigan. Mm. And I feel like you do a really good job of undermining this sense of one of these countries working better than the other one. Mm. It seems like both feel destroyed in a certain way that's different. Yes. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the characters have really interesting names, like some of the kids' names, God Knows, Bastard, Cheapo. Is that a common phenomenon in Zimbabwe?
I mean, the interesting thing is I grew up around names like God knows. The sister that I come after, my older sister, her name Sibonkosi. If you translate it into English, it means we praise God. So I guess our parents gave us names that say something. You know, it's normal. They sound normal in our native languages, of course. But then some of these are translated into English. That's how you get names like God knows. But they are perfectly ordinary. We laugh about this with Facebook friends, you know. I think somebody just wrote about the names in We Need New Names and posted the article on a Zimbabwean website. But interestingly, people just responded with list of interesting names they know. So it's something that really comes from the cultural space.
And your name is a chosen name, a pen name. What is the meaning behind NoViolet Bulawayo for you?
Violet is actually my mother's name. She passed away when I was 18 months, and I grew up not quite having a good sense of her because she was really never spoken about. So in the NO before it means with. So it was just on a personal level. It was my way of kind of honoring her memory. And then Bulawayo is the city of my people. That's where I grew up. And I guess being out of the country for so many years and not being able to go back made me nostalgic. It made me want to connect to my homeland. So I did adopt the name.
How's the book being received in Zimbabwe?
It's not quite. I think it comes out in August, so people haven't read it yet. That said, you know, I've posted snippets on Facebook and published articles online, and the reception has really been quite encouraging. I did meet some Zimbabweans yesterday who came to my reading. They've read the book, and you know, it's quite humbling to see people connect with what we have done because they're able to see themselves in the book, not just Zimbabweans. So it's been quite encouraging.
And are there certain writers that you look to as influences when you were writing We Need New Names?
I'm always saying that how I come from a culture of orature and how before I acknowledge writers, it's always important for me to acknowledge that part of my upbringing, you know, storytelling, the spoken word. And that's what I kind of tried to do here so that it doesn't, it's written, of course, but it was important for me to make it sound like a told story. I was brought up by storytellers, and that never leaves me when I'm working. But of course, there are writers that I look up to, Toni Morrison, Juno Diaz, Jhumpa Lahiri, Edward P. Jones, Edwidge Dandika, Koluma Ken. I just love beautiful writing. I love writers who handle subjects that matter. I love writers who make me think about the state of our world.
And are there any Zimbabwean writers that you would think of that people who are interested in reading more from Zimbabwe should check out?
Oh, yes. There's Yvonne Vera, Petina Kapa, Novio Chuma, who's part of the younger generation, Shima Chinochka, Chenjerai Hove, just to name a few.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And before we finish today, I just wanted to mention or hear your thoughts about the role of girls and women in We Need New Names. It feels like they are the central characters, essentially the ones that have the most moral authority in the book, both in Zimbabwe and in the Zimbabwean family in America. Mm-hmm. They feel like the ones that have the most integrity. Do you mm-hmm. feel like you're writing with feminist motives in mind?
I wouldn't call it feminist motives. I mean, the thing is that it's almost impossible to not be a feminist. I mean, you know, with being who I am, being where I come from. And what's interesting is that at the time when things were falling apart, just talking to friends and family, just looking at how much weight women carried, you know, it's just amazing. The things that they went through. I think it's a known fact when things go wrong, women kind of suffer more than men because of their gender. And of course, I'm a woman myself, and maybe part of that, and growing up around women and seeing just how much they have to deal with subconsciously made me make the book the way it was.
And it's true that Darling's father is absent for much of the book until he's in need.
Oh yes, he is. I mean, that's not to undermine the role of men in Zimbabwe, in any society, but the reality is that women are really the cornerstones of the home. When children get up, the first thing they do is, "Mommy, what are we eating today?" And it's practical for men to sort of leave and find works. If you are looking at who left, really, in terms of houses with families, men were leaving, but also women were kind of living. I was talking to a friend of mine. We went to high school together, and he's doing great work now. He's an activist, but he just told a story of how he was working with these women in the fields of Botswana. They would go and work and come back with food. That was at the time when there was no food in the stores in Zimbabwe, and how at some point, I don't know what happened. They were paid. I mean, they were paid as a group, but there arose a scenario where the guy needed to be paid through sexual favors before he paid the whole group, and they had to meet. And there were a couple of women in the group, and the older one and the younger one talked, and the younger one ended up being the one who had to grant the sexual favors before the whole group was paid. And he was telling me how, as a man, that incident woke him up to his privilege and to what women just had to endure. I'm just giving an example of the kind of things that was happening, and that can happen in this space.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And NoViolet, are you working on anything now that you could share a little bit for your fans?
I'm trying to recover from writing We Need New Names, but I'm also working on a collection of AIDS stories. AIDS is we have some of the highest rates in the region, and it's still something that's not, I'm concerned, I guess, about how it still prevails. It's not quite getting better, and how it's something that's not quite spoken about in meaningful ways. And being that I believe in the role of literature as a catalyst for dialogue and new forms of thinking, I quite feel the responsibility to sort of play my part through a collection. So we'll see how that goes.
I really like how you brought AIDS into this novel in a way that felt very effective, and I really look forward to your next collection.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for being on Between the Covers.
My pleasure.
We were talking today with debut novelist NoViolet Bulawayo about her debut novel, We Need New Names. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naimon, your host.